Tonight, I'm sharing 4 true stories of women who narrowly escaped predators who wanted to take their lives. The first is about a rideshare home that almost ended in tragedy. And before we go on, if stories like this keep you at the edge of your seat, hit subscribe. I post new scary accounts every single day. This account comes from Erin, a 27-year-old grad student who lived just outside Denver. She wasn't the type to ignore safety tips. She double-checked locks, texted her friends when she got home, and always made sure her rideshare matched the license plate on the app. She wasn't careless. That's why this night still unsettles her, because she did everything right, and it almost didn't matter. It was late January, a Saturday night. Erin had stayed at her friend's apartment until around 11:30 p.m., catching up after a long week of classes. Snow had been falling since the afternoon, leaving the roads slick and quiet. She could have slept on her friend's couch, but she had papers to finish at home and a shift at the campus library in the morning, so she ordered a rideshare. She remembered pulling her coat tighter against the wind as the car pulled up in front of the apartment building. A silver sedan, older model, with a rideshare sticker glowing faintly in the corner of the windshield. She checked her phone. Toyota Camry, license plate ending in 528. She glanced at the car, 528. Perfect. She climbed in the back seat and muttered a tired thanks. The driver nodded, but didn't reply. He was in his 40s, maybe, wearing a plain jacket, nothing memorable. Erin wasn't in the mood to chat either, so the silence didn't strike her as unusual. At first. The car moved through familiar streets. She glanced at her phone again, watching the little blue dot move along the map. But about 10 minutes into the drive, she noticed the dot veer one way while the car itself veered another. The app showed the main boulevard leading toward her neighborhood. The car turned onto a frontage road, running parallel to the highway. Her first instinct was to brush it off. Maybe he knew a faster route. She'd had drivers ignore GPS before. She looked up, ready to say something, but he cut in first, his voice low and flat. "Traffic's bad that way. This is quicker." The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd said them 100 times before. She tried to relax, but the silence pressed heavier the longer they drove. No music, no small talk, just the hum of the tires on wet asphalt. That's when she noticed the detail that flipped her stomach: the child locks. Both rear doors had the child lock latches pushed down. Her window button didn't work either. Her pulse quickened. She shifted in her seat, testing the handle. Nothing. How much longer, you think?" she asked, forcing her voice to sound casual. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. His eyes met hers, but he didn't answer right away. Then, with that same flat calm, "Don't worry, we'll get there." Her skin prickled. She dropped her gaze to her phone, and that's when the real horror hit. The car listed in the app wasn't the one she was in. The make and model matched, the color matched, the license plate she'd checked outside matched, except for one digit, one small number at the end. She hadn't noticed. Her mind spun. She thought about calling 911, but his eyes flicked down to her phone every time she shifted. He was watching her hands. If she called, what would he do? She forced herself to think. She remembered reading once that giving an excuse, something that required a stop, could create a window to escape. So she said as casually as she could, "Hey, my roommate just texted. Can we pull into that gas station? She wants me to grab something." A pause. The longest pause of her life. Finally, "Sure." The car slowed, turning into a gas station lot lit harshly by fluorescent lights. The building was nearly empty, only one other car at a pump. Erin's throat tightened. This was it. As soon as the car rolled to a stop, she didn't hesitate. She shoved her shoulder into the door handle until the lock gave, and the door swung open. She sprinted toward the gas station, leaving the door hanging wide. Inside, she rushed to the counter, blurting out what had happened. The clerk's face went pale. Without a word, he locked the front door and dialed 911 while Aaron crouched behind the counter, heart hammering so loudly she swore the man could hear it over the phone. When they looked outside minutes later, the sedan was gone. No trace. Police arrived quickly, but the security cameras showed nothing useful. The angle caught only the car pulling in and pulling out, but the license plate wasn't clear enough to read. It was as if the driver had known exactly where not to be seen. For months afterwards, Aaron obsessed over the smallest details. The way the numbers on the plate had almost matched, the flat calm of his voice, the practiced tone of his shortcut excuse. She never used a rideshare alone again. And sometimes when she drives past that gas station, she swears she can hear the echo of his words in her head. Don't worry, we'll get there.
This account comes from Valerie. She was 25 at the time, newly independent, living in a modest apartment complex tucked near Denver's industrial edge. It wasn't the safest neighborhood. Empty lots, warehouses, chain-link fences, but the rent was cheap, and she convinced herself it was fine. She worked long hours as a dental assistant, and by the time she got home, she usually just wanted to eat, shower, and collapse into bed. One evening, in early spring, she pulled into the lot later than usual. The sun had gone down, and the air was chilly in that damp way March can be, when you can still smell melting snow in the gutters. Most of the spaces were empty, except for a few cars near the entrance. She parked at the far end, closer to the row of storage units the building rented out to tenants. She had just grabbed her bag from the passenger seat when a man called out to her. "Hey, could you give me a hand real quick?" He came from the direction of a pickup truck parked near the units. Middle-aged, sturdy build, plain baseball cap pulled low. He carried a box hugged against his chest, and his voice was casual enough that she didn't feel an immediate jolt of danger. Valerie hesitated. She didn't like being approached in parking lots, especially when it was dark, but she reminded herself that this was her home too. If someone else lived here, it wasn't strange they'd ask for help. She almost said no, but something in her, the part of her raised to be polite, made her nod. "Yeah, sure," she said. The man smiled thinly and jerked his chin toward the row of units. "Just over here." She followed him reluctantly, her sneakers crunching on gravel. The row of units stretched along the edge of the lot. Metal doors painted a dull beige. Some had padlocks, others stood empty. He led her to the farthest one. The lock was unlatched, the door rolled up halfway, leaving a shadowed gap. Inside, the fluorescent floodlight from the lot spilled enough light to show a scatter of boxes, a rolled-up rug, and a couple of old pieces of furniture. Nothing unusual. "Could you just slide that one in for me?" he asked, gesturing with his chin. She stepped forward and crouched slightly to set the box inside. That's when her eyes adjusted to the deeper shadows at the back. Two metal folding chairs sat there, facing each other. Between them lay a coil of rope, neatly arranged like it had been placed carefully rather than dropped. Valerie froze. Her first thought was that it looked staged, like a setup waiting for someone. The sight hit her stomach like ice water. She straightened too quickly, brushing dust from her hands. "Actually, I just remembered I've got food on the stove. I need to run." The excuse sounded flimsy even to her, but she forced a smile and turned back toward the opening. The man had stepped aside to let her pass. He didn't argue, he didn't try to stop her, but as she walked past him, she heard it. The metallic rattle of the door handle, sharp in the quiet. He'd flicked it with his fingers, testing it. She kept walking, not running, not showing panic, just moving fast enough to be obvious she had somewhere to be. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She unlocked her car with trembling hands, climbed in, and locked the doors in one practiced motion. Through the windshield, she saw him standing in the lot. He hadn't followed her. He wasn't even pretending to fuss with the boxes anymore. He was just standing there, arms crossed, watching her. She started the car and pulled out, her hands so tight on the wheel that her knuckles ached. Only when the complex was in her rearview mirror did she allow herself to breathe. That night, she called her dad and told him the whole thing, embarrassed by how shaken she sounded. He didn't laugh. He told her she had done exactly the right thing and that she should report it. The next morning, after little sleep, she went to the leasing office. She recounted the incident, expecting the manager to roll their eyes or shrug it off. Instead, the woman at the desk frowned deeply. "That can't be right," she said. "We don't rent those end units. They're sealed. They haven't been used for years." Valerie felt her stomach drop. "Well, one of them was open last night." "No," the manager said firmly. "They're chained shut." After work, she forced herself to check in daylight. She walked past the row, heart racing, and when she reached the far end, she stopped cold. The unit she'd entered the night before was padlocked. Not just locked, chained across with a thick metal loop, a laminated property company notice taped to the door. The paper was yellowed from weather, dated 3 months earlier. Her mind reeled. Had she remembered the wrong unit? Had he broken in? Or had the door been sealed all along, and she'd followed him into something she wasn't supposed to see? She never saw the man again, but in the weeks that followed, she found herself replaying every detail. The neat coil of rope, the chairs facing each other, the rattle of the door handle as she walked out. She told herself it was coincidence, that maybe there was some innocent explanation, but late at night, lying awake in her new apartment, Valerie couldn't shake the thought that if she had taken just one more step inside, if she had lingered, that door might have rolled down behind her, and no one would have known where to look. This account comes from Dana, who was 29 when it happened. She worked as a regional sales rep, the kind of job that had her driving through 3 states a week, sleeping in roadside motels more often than in her own bed. She was used to the fatigue of travel, the vending machines, the flickering neon signs, the way some rooms always smelled faintly of bleach and cigarettes, no matter how clean they looked. She thought she'd learned how to tune it all out. One night, on a work trip through Idaho, she booked a room at a small motel just off the highway. It wasn't her first choice, her usual chain was booked, but she told herself it would be fine. She checked in just before midnight. The lobby was empty, except for a clerk who barely looked up as she slid her the key card. Her room was on the 2nd floor, at the very end of the hall. The carpet was threadbare, the curtains stiff, and the heater rattled when it kicked on. But the sheets looked clean enough, so she set her bag down, kicked off her shoes, and lay across the bed with her laptop, answering emails until her eyes blurred. Around 1:30 a.m., she shut it down and turned off the light. She expected the usual muffled sounds of a roadside motel. Cars pulling in, doors slamming, a TV playing faintly through a wall. At first, that's what she got. Then, through the paper-thin wall behind her headboard, she heard voices. A man's voice, low and steady, and another voice answering. At first, she thought nothing of it, just someone talking too loudly on the phone. But after a few minutes, she realized there was no back-and-forth conversation. The man's voice spoke in long, steady stretches. The other voice was weaker, short, almost pleading. Her stomach tightened. She pressed her ear to the wall. "Don't cry. That won't help," the man's voice said, calm and clipped. A chill ran through her. She pulled back, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a TV. Maybe she was mishearing. She turned on the lamp, stared at the wall, listening harder. There was a scuffle, something that thudded against the wall so hard her headboard trembled. She jumped to her feet. Now she heard it clearly. A woman's voice, higher, shaking. "Please, just let me go." Dana's body went rigid. Every instinct screamed to call the front desk. She grabbed the phone, but the line was dead, just static on the other end. She picked up her cell instead and dialed the front desk number on the check-in slip. No answer. The ringing went on until she hung up. The voices behind the wall kept rising. The man's voice snapped sharp commands, the woman's muffled cries.
She thought of dialing 911, but what if she was wrong? What if it was just a fight or a couple yelling at each other? She froze, phone in hand, caught between action and doubt. Then came the sound that broke her hesitation, the scrape of furniture across the floor, and a muffled sob that was cut off too suddenly. She dialed, this time 911. Her voice shook as she whispered her location and what she'd heard. The operator told her to stay in her room with the door locked. Help was on the way. Those 15 minutes were the longest of her life. She sat on the floor with her back against the far wall, lights off, trying to breathe quietly. She kept hearing faint sounds through the wall, but she couldn't tell if they were real or just her imagination. When the red and blue lights flashed across her curtains, relief nearly buckled her knees. She heard shouting in the hall, heavy footsteps, then the door next to hers being forced open. And then silence. The officers didn't come to her door. They didn't explain. She sat in the dark until dawn, too shaken to move. When she checked out the next morning, the clerk didn't meet her eyes. He slid her the receipt without a word. She asked, "What happened in the room next to mine?" The man hesitated, then said, "We don't have anyone checked into that room." Her skin went cold. She didn't argue, didn't press. She just took the receipt and walked out, her legs trembling. She still doesn't know what she heard that night, but she swears she wasn't alone on that floor, and whatever was happening in that room, she wasn't supposed to hear it.
This last story comes from Marissa, who was 22 at the time. She was a photography student, ambitious and eager to build her portfolio, but also broke, juggling classes and part-time work. She wanted to break into the industry, and she knew that meant saying yes to opportunities that came her way. In her words, "I thought I could tell the difference between sketchy and safe. I thought I was smart enough. That's what still bothers me, that I almost wasn't." It started with a flyer. Pinned to the corkboard outside her campus library, alongside the usual roommate ads and lost cat posters, was a sheet of white paper. The headline, in bold block letters, read, "Female models needed, paid portfolio work." It promised $50 an hour, great for students, and flexible scheduling. At the bottom was a tear-off strip with a phone number. She hesitated, but the thought of easy money for a few hours was tempting. She texted. The reply came fast, polite, and professional. The man introduced himself as Eric. He said he was a freelance photographer building his book and that he rented studio space in an old commercial building downtown. His tone reassured her. No weird emojis, no flirty comments, just straightforward logistics. They arranged a Saturday afternoon session. When she pulled up to the building, her nerves flared. It wasn't a modern studio, but a converted warehouse with boarded windows and peeling paint. The words "Creative Suites" were stenciled faintly on a fading sign above the entrance. The street was nearly empty, just a liquor store across the way, and a scattering of parked cars. She almost drove away. But then she reminded herself she'd told him she'd be there, and she hated the idea of looking unprofessional. She locked her car and went inside. The hallway was dim, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The linoleum floor was scuffed and stained, the kind of building that had been repurposed too many times. Half the doors were locked, their nameplates empty. Eric met her at the door. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, average-looking in a button-down shirt and jeans. He smiled warmly, shook her hand, and introduced himself like any professional would. Inside, the room looked legitimate enough. A backdrop was set up, softbox lights glowed faintly, and a DSLR sat on a tripod. A desk sat against one wall, cluttered with papers and a coffee mug. Marissa exhaled. Maybe her nerves were silly. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. He positioned her near the backdrop, adjusted lights, asked for standard poses. He made small talk about photography, even complimented her for holding poses well. The click of the shutter came at regular intervals. She began to relax. to think maybe she had judged too quickly. But slowly, she noticed something was off. He wasn't taking as many photos as it seemed. He'd fiddle with his camera, murmur instructions, but sometimes minutes passed without a single click. Instead, he just looked at her. Not leering, not openly creepy, just watching, eyes fixed in a way that made her skin prickle. "Hold that," he said once, his voice low. She froze in the pose, waiting for the shutter. It never came. Her unease grew. She told herself she was overthinking. She needed the money. At one point, he excused himself to fetch another lens from the back room. Left alone, she stretched her arms, trying to shake the tension. That's when she noticed the shelves. Along the wall, beside the desk, sat rows of folders. Dozens of them, organized neatly in vertical stacks. Each spine was labeled in tidy handwriting. Women's names: Lydia, Caroline, Stephanie. Curious, she pulled one part way out. Her breath caught. Inside were photographs. Hundreds of them. Some looked like studio shots, posed like hers, but others weren't. They were candid. Women walking down streets, sitting in cafes, entering buildings. Shots that looked like they'd been taken without the subject's knowledge. She shoved the folder back just as she heard footsteps. Eric returned, smiling like nothing was wrong, but his eyes lingered on her just a beat too long, as if he'd noticed her curiosity. "You good?" he asked lightly. "Yeah," she lied, forcing a smile. They continued. He directed her into another pose, this time near the shelves, close to the wall. She obeyed, but her pulse pounded. She realized he was subtly steering her farther from the door, closer into the corner. Each adjustment in position nudged her out of easy escape. The blinds on the one window were pulled tightly shut. The fluorescent light above buzzed louder. Her instincts screamed. She forced a casual laugh. "Actually, I just remembered. I'm supposed to meet a friend. I'll need to head out soon." His smile didn't falter, but he didn't hide his disappointment. "We still had a few more shots," he said softly. "I'll reschedule," she blurted. "Next week." He hesitated, but then nodded. "All right." But he insisted on walking her out. Down the dim hallway, his footsteps matched hers too closely. He walked just a little behind her, his presence heavy. Outside, the afternoon light felt like oxygen. She reached her car quickly, fumbling with her keys. He stood near the entrance, watching as she got in. She drove away with her hands shaking on the wheel. It wasn't until later that night that the realization hit her hardest. In that studio, when she'd glanced at the shelves, she'd noticed something in the corner of her eye. On the desk, half hidden under papers, was a folder with a blank spine. Just one word written in the same neat handwriting. Her name. She hadn't opened it, hadn't dared, but she knew what that meant. He'd prepared it before she even arrived. She never went back. She deleted his number, avoided the building whenever she passed downtown. She told herself she'd overreacted, that maybe it had all been nothing, but deep down, she knew. She wasn't the first name on his shelf, and she might not have left if she'd stayed any longer.